What is the best wheel size for an enduro bike? While the majority of models on the market are 29ers, brands are increasingly offering mullet configurations as an alternative. And while the early mixed wheel models were little more than frankenbike mashups, the bikes you can buy now are bespoke variants without compromises in geometry. So the aim of this video is to provide some advice and insight to help you choose the right wheel size.
So Danny, what have you brought along for us to ride today?
So we've got two of the brand new Intense Tracers. We've got one with 29-inch wheels, front and rear, and we've got one mullet bike.
So what exactly is a mullet for anyone that doesn't know the terminology?
So some people call it a mullet bike, some people call it MX, some people call it mixed wheel sizes. It all means the same thing. It's basically a 29-inch wheel up front with a 27.5-inch wheel at the back.
Okay, so we've got two different wheel size combinations, but what kind of bike is the Intense Tracer?
So the Tracer is Intense's Enduro bike.
Okay.
It uses the latest version of the virtual pivot point system that Intense has been using for like 20 years now. Yeah, so it's the second bike that Intense has made where the lower link drives the shock. The first one was the M29 downhill bike. So this is the first kind of pedal bike that uses that configuration. It's not the first mullet bike they've made either. They made the Taser e-bike, which came out in 2018. So you could say they're not really...
So they're not jumping on the bandwagon.
They're not jumping on the bandwagon. They've got a bit of experience with that. It's 170 millimeters travel front and rear. Full carbon frame, uses a carbon upper link with titanium hardware.
Just to save some weight and kind of give it a high-end feel.
Exactly. New feature on this is the internal storage, the CHAD storage in the underside of the down tube. In addition, they've got this kind of neat mudguard here.
Yeah, which just helps keeps all the junk and the dirt out of the shock and stuff, doesn't out of the linkage and stuff.
Exactly,
it's a really good feature.
It's got a kind of neat quick release pull-out lever for the rear axle. Okay. Internal cable routing comes standard with this integrated rubber frame protection. So they're both the Pro Spec model, which comes in at 5,799. They're fitted with the excellent Fox Performance Elite fork, which has both high and low speed damping adjustment and the superb Grip 2 damper. Both have Shimano XT drivetrains and brakes with E13 cranks, wheels, dropper posts and bar stem combos.
So it's pretty much a comprehensive modern enduro bike with all the features you'd expect on a modern enduro bike.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
So we've established the things these bikes share. What separates them other than just the rear wheel size? So
the swing arms on both bikes are different.
Okay.
So we have shorter chainstays on the mullet bike.
Yeah.
Longer, obviously, on the 29er. We've also got a coil shock on the mullet bike.
Yeah.
And an air shock on the 29er. And we've got slightly different tyre treads. Well, we have different tyre treads.
Yeah, but the casings and the compounds are identical.
We've got the Assegai front and rear on the 29er, and we've got Minions, DHF and DHR on the mullet bike.
On the rear, yeah. So Danny, is there a big difference in weight between these two bikes?
Barely anything. 150 grams difference between the two bikes.
Not as much as you'd expect. So, and how does that shake down? Obviously, this bike's got a coil shock, and that one's got a bigger, which I'm assuming is a heavier rear wheel.
Exactly, you're exactly right there. So the mullet bike is a little bit heavier.
Okay.
But mostly it's because of the coil shock, because the rear wheel is actually lighter than the 29er.
Okay, so you mentioned that so both of these bikes have got different swing arms. So do they also have different geometry?
So the geometry is only different at the back, basically.
Okay, so head angle, reach, BB height are all pretty close?
They're almost identical.
Okay.
In terms of angles, within 0.1, something like that.
So within the error of measurement, basically.
Yeah. All of the dimensions that we measured on these bikes are going to be put in the description if you want to sort of geek out on the differences, and also you can compare those to Intense's measurements as well. But if we're looking at the most significant differences with the bikes is the chainstay measurement, which or the rear center, whatever you want to call it. So this is like a 450 chainstay on the 29er.
So the longer chainstay on the 29er.
And a 437 on the Mullet bike.
I mean, that's something we've seen a lot with like e-bikes. Recently, a lot of e-bikes come through Mullet on the rear, and one of the reasons is because they've got this big bulky motor, and one way to make the rear ends a little bit shorter is to go with the Mullet configuration. Is that what they're trying to do with this bike, or is it more just they're offering different wheel sizes to give people options?
I think there's definitely an element of that, trying to make a slightly more agile, playful bike to appeal to a slightly different customer. I think also there's on analog bikes, I think there's a wheel clearance, a tyre clearance, ass clearance kind of element to it. That's that's essentially where Mullet bikes, why they've become more popular on analog bikes, is because of trickle down from
downhill
DH and Enduro, where sort of riders of more average height, they've got lots of travel and they want more clearance at the back.
Yeah, basically you buzz your ass on the
exactly.
tire.
So that's kind of one of the big elements of why people choose Mullet bikes, or why you may be choosing a Mullet bike. The other point about the geometry that's worth mentioning is that the BB heights are like pretty much identical. They are identical on both these bikes, but the 29er is in the low position and the Mullet bike is in the high position on the flip chip.
Okay.
So you could
potentially go lower.
You could go lower on that
on this bike
if you wanted to. Again, if you run bike parks, you could get away with it without the sort of worry about clipping pedals everywhere
and stuff. So basically, the fit on these bikes, from sort of your hand position to your bum position on the saddle to where your feet are on the pedals, is identical.
Exactly. Yep. The front ends are identical, and the way that they sit built up is basically identical as well. From the BB forward, basically.
Which makes it a really good test, because like we've played around with Mullet wheel sizes and mixed wheel sizes and stuff in the past, and they've always been like adapted and modified bikes. This is actually helping us kind of really isolate the difference with just the back end of the bike. Yeah,
it's definitely made it easier to compare the two. Before you might have had a 27.5 bike that you put a 29-inch front wheel on, and that's just kind of jacked up the front end. It's the BB's too high, angles are too slack, and if you do the reverse, you put a 27.5 wheel on a 29er, then you end up with a low, BB that's too low, seat angle that's too slack. So it's always a compromise. Whereas theoretically, these bikes should be perfect for their kind of intended use.
Yeah. So Danny, you measured these bikes, right?
Yeah.
So this isn't intense clean geometry, but we normally have a lot of variation between like bikes that we measure and then we go online and they don't actually match up that well. How did these bikes measure up?
Yeah, they compared really good actually to Intense's measurements. I mean, there was a few differences here and there, but on the whole, it was pretty accurate. And like one thing that really struck me when I looked at the two was that Intense take account of the whole geometry change when you move the flip chip, which not all brands do.
Yeah, some of them just do like head angle and seat angle or something, that they don't do the reach and they don't do the knock-on effects that it has elsewhere in the geometry.
Yeah.
Do you think one of the reasons why the bikes were like pretty similar to each other and to the listed geometry is because like you've got a full carbon chassis?
Yeah, it's obviously a lot more consistent to pull a frame out of a mold than it is to weld and heat treat and stuff like that. Yeah.
So we've said that these bikes are really similar, which makes it a really good experiment, but they're not quite identical, though. There are a few little things, if you're being really picky, that haven't been accounted for. Can you just go into those, please?
Because both bikes have got exactly the same components on them, the larger wheel on the 29er means that the gearing is slightly taller than the Mullet bike.
So they didn't compensate for that with a different size chainring?
No, you've got the same chainring sizes on both bikes, same cassette. So the bigger wheel just means that this is slightly taller gearing.
Okay.
And then you could argue also that the brake rotors are both the same size.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd want a slightly bigger rotor for a bigger
29er.
Wheel.
Yeah, just to match the braking torque. Yeah.
In terms of gearing, I think if you put a 2-tooth bigger chainring on the Mullet bike, you're basically equaled out.
And then 20 mil on the rotor.
20 mil on the rotor.
Probably sorted out too, with like an adapter. So before we get into what we thought of these two bikes when we rode them back to back, are there any kind of stereotypes between 29ers and mixed wheel size bikes that we should kind of like air?
Yeah, definitely there are. I think that the main one is probably that that Mullet bikes are more agile, more playful, kind of basically more fun than 29ers. I think that's why most people would choose one maybe over a 29er.
Okay.
But there's other things as well, like kind of hand in hand with that is that they are thought of as being easier to manual, easier to lift the front end.
And that's a direct result probably of just the fact that you can have a shorter chainstay, a shorter rear end.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a byproduct almost of the smaller rear wheel rather than a direct
result of it.
Yeah. Sort of more on the 29er front, you've got perhaps more stability, better rollover. So that would indicate that the Mullet bike maybe has slightly less high-speed stability and slightly less rollover.
And then that could really play into racing too, couldn't it? Where like if the goal is from A to B as fast as possible, then maybe there's an argument that the 29 is a more effective tool, whereas this actually might be more fun to ride between A and B. And it also depends on the track.
Yep.
Like if the tracks are tighter, steeper, more acceleration, more deceleration, not just kind of big, wide open, fast, rough trails, then the Mullet bike could actually be advantageous over the 29er rather than having the bigger wheels.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've found this over the years, you know, moving from 26 to 29, 27.5 to 29. We've gone through all this. They've all got their advantages and disadvantages, and it's about picking the right bike for your style of riding, the terrain that you ride on, because some bikes will work better in some situations and trails, and some will work in others.
And I think what's really cool is that Intensive giving you like two really good options. Yep. One of these bikes isn't like, they haven't designed one bike and then basically made it for 29 and 20 and mixed wheel size and kind of have a compromise for both, which is we saw a lot with 29 and 27.5 bikes. You kind of got a bespoke bike for each. So Danny, I basically just turned up. You had these two bikes. I didn't know anything about them other than one was a 29 and one was a Mullet. We got on them, we did some back-to-back runs. What was our biggest takeaway from that testing?
Probably that there's not a huge difference.
Yeah, I'd say so too. Yeah, that was my takeaway for sure. We had test track with the descent and a climb, and you did timed runs on both. How did that pan out?
So I wasn't expecting much, but I tried to choose a track that would help the Mullet bike as much as possible. Basically just turn, change of direction the whole way. And then a climb as well to see whether there was, you know, much difference there. So yeah, in terms of the timed runs on the descent, there was nothing in it.
Okay.
Like 1% or something like that. I mean, it's statistically insignificant.
Yeah.
And in terms of like what I felt when we were riding them, there was most of the time there was not a great deal of difference. There was one point where the difference between the two bikes was really highlighted.
I know what point you're talking about. That point where we swapped at the top, and basically there was no run into the trail, so no time to kind of fine tune your position on the bike. And I think I ran wide on the first corner, and you basically oversteered.
Yeah, and what it came out of was spending 4 runs riding the 29er, so getting really quite used to the handling traits of that bike, and then swapping to the 279 Mullet bike, and your whole body and brain needing to recalibrate.
Yeah. And it's a small calibration, but it was enough for us both to mess up the first 2 corners.
Totally. And it was exactly the stereotype of what the two bikes are, in terms of one being more stable and more reluctant to turn, and one being super agile and needing less effort to make changes of direction. It was
so basically you got off the 29er and got onto the mixed wheel size bike, and your inputs were geared towards the bigger, more stable bike. And then on this thing, you put the same inputs in, and the bike just turns so much quicker because it's more reactive to them. And I did the opposite. That's why I ran wide on the first corner. I was like, what? I was in the bushes. What's going on?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. It was really interesting to have that experience of, you know, just having to change your basically your inputs to the bikes. But the other interesting part was then within one run, we had tuned into them. And they felt totally natural.
It's like you've been riding all your life.
Yeah. So there is a difference, but that difference can easily be adapted to.
Yeah.
It just doesn't take a lot of time.
My big takeaway from that day of testing with you, other than it was really nice just to turn up and ride some bikes that I didn't have anything to do with, it was great, was that you can basically, your body's really adaptable. And these bikes have got different weight distribution. That's something we really noticed when we were setting the forks up. Like we set the forks up the same initially, and then we dropped the pressure on the 27.5 bike, and the weight distribution on the bike's different. And one thing we noticed when we set the bikes up with the same pressures in the forks initially. And then I was riding this bike, and I was like, oh, the front end feels a bit high. And then we were looking at what sort of travel we were getting out of. We weren't even getting close to like 70% of the travel. And then I kind of thought about it a bit more, and we talked about it, and we were like, well, yeah, of course, because it's got a shorter rear end. That means there's less weight on the front, so we need less air in the fork. Whereas in the 29er, you've got a longer chainstay, which drives weight onto the fork. So once we let air out of this fork, the bikes felt much more. So they got even closer in terms of response and feel.
Yeah.
But I thought what was really interesting was what happened on the climbs.
Yep.
Because that's a big part. These are enduro bikes, and that's a big part of enduro racing. They're big days in the saddle. There's a lot of climbing to be done.
Yep.
These bikes aren't just about going downhill.
Yep. So the timed runs on the climbs, there was a 4% difference between
in favor of
the 29er.
Of course.
Yeah,
yeah.
Exactly. So the average heart rate was actually like very slightly lower on this bike, but the times were faster by 4%.
Yeah, so it was quicker and less effort.
Yeah. So, I mean, we were sort of trying to work out what exactly this might be. It's probably a combination of elements. It's a slightly lighter bike. It's
150 grams.
150 grams. Well, I mean, that makes a big difference to roadies, doesn't it?
It does, totally, yeah. If you've got to climb up a 2,000 meter mountain, then maybe it does make a big difference, yeah.
You've got slightly different weight distribution.
Yeah.
You've got better rollover from the 29.
And the climb we were on was pretty constant rate.
Yeah.
And it was quite smooth too. It had small stones on it, but it wasn't chunky. Really. You wouldn't say it was chunky. So yeah.
No, that might have made a difference.
Yeah.
The tyre tread pattern maybe made a slight difference.
Yeah.
But it could have been a combination of all these factors. Yeah. Maybe the gearing as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And the cadence that you're spinning.
I'll be 100% honest with you. I couldn't have guessed that from riding both bikes up the climbs with you. I couldn't have told you which one was quicker or which one was less effort, even though there was a marked difference in them.
Yeah, yeah. So
I was surprised when you told me that the time difference was that amount, and that the fact that your heart rate was lower, so the effort was lower.
Yeah, yeah, and it kind of rings true for again the stereotypes we were talking about earlier, isn't it? It fits that stereotype, and it's probably why, you know, if you can fit on a 29er, it's why people ride them. You know, if you're a racer and you want the fastest bike, you tend to ride a 29er, don't you?
So do you think that's the real story here? Is about proportions and fit? The fact that you can have a shorter chainstay with a smaller rear wheel, and then you can make the front end of the bike shorter, so the bike's kind of balanced, and you can maintain that balance. It's almost like a kind of way of having proportional chainstays.
It is. It's like taking it one step further, I guess, isn't it?
Proportional wheel. Yeah,
exactly. And I think a lot of it does come down to how tall you are. Really, it's is if you're average height like we are, it's you've got the beauty.
Yeah, we can ride either of these bikes comfortably.
You're in a great position. You can ride both. But if you're slightly shorter, you're probably going to get on better with that bike. Not only will you have more rear wheel clearance, but the proportions of the chainstay versus the front centre
are going
to be better for you. It's going to be easier to manoeuvre the bike. It's going to feel more fun to ride. The 29er is going to fit better people who are, slightly taller than us.
Because they're going to want a longer chainstay because their saddle height's a lot higher. They're a lot taller. The bike has got way longer front center. So basically the characteristics can be kind of balanced across both bikes. And I think that's a really I think that's a really cool thing for brands. If they've got a feel of a bike that they think we really believe in, how this is how it should ride and this is how it should respond, they can actually offer that to the same feeling to a wider size range.
Yeah, it's. I think it's a really good development. That's kind of we've seen over the last few years with the proportional chainstays, and now we're sort of as a byproduct of different wheel sizes and those wanting shorter chainstays, we're getting this sort of proportional wheel size coming out of the wash as well. It's it's definitely helps riders get the right bike for them, really, I think.
So Danny, what I'm hearing you saying is that it doesn't really matter.
I think, you know, much as we'd like to say, yeah, this one's the best, this one's whatever, it's just not the case. They're you know, the most black and white difference between these bikes is the colour.
Oh, I like how you got that in there. It's true.
What, you know, if we're digging a bit deeper, there are subtle differences between the bikes in terms of the agility and stuff, but you can get used to them. You know, you can adapt your riding style to ride both pretty much as hard. And
I think it's also because we are both average height.
Yep.
So we can literally just hop from one to the other, and it's really easy. We can, like, within seconds we can adapt. Whereas if this was a kind of test and one guy was like 6'4" and there was another guy or girl that was 5'3",
it's easy. Easy to make a decision.
They just go, I can't ride that, and I want to ride that. It would be black and white.
Absolutely. And equally, if you're an enduro racer and you're of our height, I would choose the 29er.
Yeah.
If I'm not interested in racing at all, I just wanted to ride a bike part and slash turns.
Slap loamy turns.
I'd take the 279 Mullet bike. It's, So I think we've learned something from it, but we're not going to be writing a thesis about it.
No, well, I won't be anyway.
So thanks for watching. I hope you found it interesting and informative. And if you really want to geek out on all the details, we put all the measurements, weights, etc. in the description below. If you're new to the channel, like and subscribe and ring that bell. Don't put that in the video, yeah?